This is Process and Reality, the only officially unofficial guide to reading Alfred North Whitehead. I'm your host, Tyler Davis. Welcome to the show. Hey everybody, before we continue, I just want to let you know about Anchor, the platform that I'm using to create this podcast. If you enjoy the quality and the ease of access you get to this podcast, well, you need to try out Anchor because they distribute everything for you. It's super awesome. It's totally free. You can use it right from your phone or your computer. Their creation tools actually allow you to record and edit your podcast. So it sounds super great. They're going to distribute it on all the platforms, like I said, so you can hear it from Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and tons more places. And you get paid for the ads ultimately that you run, and there's no minimum listenership. So you should totally go download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm, get yourself started, start your own podcast, start saying something important, get out there, and make it happen. Welcome back, everybody. We're going to pick right back up where we left off at page 11 on section 5. This is episode 8. Every science must devise its own instruments. The tool required for philosophy is language. Thus, philosophy redesigns language in the same way that, in a physical science, pre-existing appliances are redesigned. It's exactly at this point that the appeal to facts is a difficult operation. This appeal is not solely to the expression of the facts in current verbal statements. The adequacy of such sentences is the main question at issue. It is true that the general agreement of mankind as to experienced facts is best expressed in language. But the language of literature breaks down precisely at the task of expressing in explicit form the larger generalities, the very generalities which metaphysics seeks to express. The point is that every proposition refers to a universe exhibiting some general, systematic metaphysical character. Apart from this background, the separate entities which go to form the proposition and the proposition as a whole are without determinate character. Nothing has been defined because every definite entity requires a systematic universe to supply its requisite status. Thus, every proposition proposing a fact must, in its complete analysis, propose the general character of the universe required for that fact. There are no self-sustained facts floating in non-entity. This doctrine of the impossibility of tearing a proposition from its systematic context in the actual world is a direct consequence of the 4th and the 20th of the fundamental categorical explanations, which shall be engaged in expanding and illustrating. A proposition can embody partial truth because it only demands a certain type of systematic environment, which is presupposed in its meaning. It does not refer to the universe in all its detail. One practical aim of metaphysics is the accurate analysis of propositions, not merely of metaphysical propositions, but of quite ordinary propositions such as, "There is beef for dinner today, and Socrates is mortal." The one genus of facts which constitutes the field of some special science requires some common metaphysical presupposition respecting the universe. It is merely credulous to accept verbal phrases as adequate statements of propositions. The distinction between verbal phrases and complete propositions is one of the reasons why the logician's rigid alternative, true or false, is so largely irrelevant for the pursuit of knowledge. The excessive trust in linguistic phrases has been the well-known reason vitiating so much of the philosophy and physics among the Greeks and among the medieval thinkers who continued the Greek traditions. For example, John Stuart Mill writes, "They, the Greeks, had great difficulty in distinguishing between things which their language confounded, or in putting mentally together things which it distinguished, and could hardly combine the objects in nature into any classes but those which were made for them by the popular phrases of their own country, or at least could not help fancying those classes to be natural, and all others arbitrary and artificial. Accordingly, scientific investigation among the Greek schools of speculation and their followers in the Middle Ages was little more than a mere sifting and analysis of the notions attached to common language. They thought that by determining the meaning of words, they could become acquainted with the facts. Mill then proceeds to quote from Whewell, a paragraph illustrating the same weakness of Greek thought. But neither Mill nor Whewell tracks this difficulty about language down to its source. They both presuppose that language does enunciate well-defined propositions. This is quite untrue. Language is thoroughly indeterminate by reason of the fact that every occurrence presupposes some systematic type of environment. For example, the word Socrates, referring to the philosopher in one sentence, may stand for an entity presupposing a more closely defined background than the word Socrates with the same reference in another sentence. The word mortal affords an analogous possibility. A precise language must await a completed metaphysical knowledge. The technical language of philosophy represents attempts of various schools of thought to obtain explicit expression of general ideas presupposed by the facts of experience. It follows that any novelty in metaphysical doctrines exhibits some measure of disagreement with statements of the facts to be found in current philosophical literature. The extent of disagreement measures the extent of metaphysical divergence. It is, therefore, no valid criticism on one metaphysical school to point out that its doctrines do not follow from the verbal expression of the facts accepted by another school. The whole contention is that the doctrines in question supply a closer approach to fully expressed propositions. The truth itself is nothing else than how the composite natures of the organic actualities of the world obtain adequate representation in the divine nature. Such representations compose the consequent nature of God, which evolves in its relationship to the evolving world without derogation to the eternal completion of its primordial conceptual nature. In this way, the ontological principle is maintained, since there can be no determinate truth correlating impartially the partial experiences of many actual entities, apart from one actual entity to which it can be referred. The reaction of the temporal world on the nature of God is considered subsequently in Part 5. It is there termed the consequent nature of God. Whatever is found in practice must lie within the scope of the metaphysical description. When the description fails to include the practice, the metaphysics is inadequate and requires revision. There can be no appeal to practice to supplement metaphysics, so long as we remain contented with our metaphysical doctrines. Metaphysics is nothing but the description of the generalities which apply to all the details of practice. No metaphysical system can hope entirely to satisfy these pragmatic tests. At the best, such a system will remain only an approximation to the general truths which are sought. In particular, there are no precisely stated axiomatic certainties from which to start. There is not even the language in which to frame them. The only possible procedure is to start from verbal expressions, which, when taken by themselves with the current meaning of their words, are ill-defined and ambiguous. These are not premises to be immediately reasoned from apart from elucidation by further discussion. They are endeavors to state general principles which will be exemplified in the subsequent description of the facts of experience. This subsequent elaboration should elucidate the meanings to be assigned to the words and phrases employed. Such meanings are incapable of accurate apprehension apart from a correspondingly accurate apprehension of the metaphysical background which the universe provides for them. But no language can be anything but elliptical, requiring a leap of the imagination to understand its meaning in its relevance to immediate experience. The position of metaphysics in the development of culture cannot be understood without remembering that no verbal statement is the adequate expression of a proposition. An old established metaphysical system gains a false air of adequate precision from the fact that its words and phrases have passed into current literature. Thus, propositions expressed in its language are more easily correlated to our flitting intuitions into metaphysical truth. When we trust these verbal statements and argue as though they adequately analyzed meaning, we're led into difficulties which take the shape of negations of what in practice is presupposed. But when they are proposed as first principles, they assume an unmerited air of sober obviousness. Their defect is that the true propositions which they do express lose their fundamental character when subjected to adequate expression. For example, consider the types of propositions such as, the grass is green, and the whale is big. This subject-predicate form of a statement seems so simple, leading straight to a metaphysical first principle. And yet in these examples, it conceals such complex, diverse meanings. As we start again, first let's note that every science has tools for carrying out the discipline. Archaeology, for instance, has delicate excavation instruments. A doctor has a stethoscope and 1,000 other instruments, and a physicist has the Large Hadron Collider if she's lucky. But the tool for philosophy is language. Philosophy redesigns language in the same way the physical sciences redesign previous disciplines. Think about alchemy and phrenology. These are now defunct disciplines, and the sciences have integrated the parts that were valuable and spit out the bones. Appealing to facts in language is difficult. Appealing to facts in current language is also part of the difficulty. The difficulty is whether or not language is an adequate tool for philosophy. On the one hand, we can express agreed upon facts best through language. On the other hand, language breaks down right where we need it to express the big general ideas we are after in explicit form. These are the generalities that metaphysics seeks to express, so this is the difficulty for metaphysics. Every proposition refers to a universe which has general metaphysical properties. Apart from these properties, the parts of the proposition and the proposition as a whole are indeterminate. Every definite entity requires a systematic universe to support it. Therefore, every proposition which proposes a fact must propose the general character of the universe required for that fact. There are no self-sustained facts floating in non-entity. There are no things in themselves. If you recall, if you're familiar at all with Kant, this is a famous assertion of Kant, and it's a rejection that Whitehead sets forward in the preface. You are not allowed to believe in the theoretical construct of the world constructed by subjective experiences. Additionally, this is also a rejection of the doctrine of vacuous actuality. Now, this idea that it's impossible to tear a proposition from its systematic context in the actual world is a direct consequence of the 4th and 20th categories in the scheme which he introduces in Chapter 2, Section 2. We're going to skip ahead here, and I'm going to give you some spoilers here just so you can understand what he's talking about, because so far you have no context for what he is referring to. The 4th category is that the one general metaphysical character which applies to all entities is the potential for many entities to become one actuality. In other words, any number of entities may become one actuality through the process called concrescence. This applies whether or not the entities themselves are actual or non-actual. Every item in each entity's universe is a part of each concrescence. In other words, the nature of a being is that it is a potential for every becoming of every entity, including itself. This is Whitehead's principle of relativity. The 20th category is that the definition of function is to contribute determination to the actual entities of experience in the nexus of some actual world. Now first, let's define a nexus. A connection or series of connections linking two or more things. For example, the nexus between industry and political power. A connected group of series. A nexus of ideas. The central and most important point or place. The nexus of all this activity was the disco. We are not able to abstract the definition of or determination and self-identity of one entity from the community of the various functions of all entities. We can only analyze determination in terms of definiteness and position. Part of the principle of relativity is that all things are potential for an entity's becoming. Part of the principle of the ontological principle that we'll later define the ontological principle, but we're going to do it right now, I guess, is that we've mentioned it a couple times. You cannot conceive of an entity in abstraction from the universe. That actually doesn't exist. So we can only analyze the determination of an individual in terms of what Whitehead's going to define as definiteness and position. So what are definiteness and position? We can illustrate determination from certain eternal objects or forms of definiteness. We can illustrate position from a relationship in a nexus of actual entities. This is getting super, super dense right now, and I promise it'll get a little bit better, so hang in. Eternal objects are pure potentials with regard to specific determination of fact. I'll say it again. Eternal objects are pure potentials with regard to specific determination of fact. They are forms of definiteness. Forms of definiteness. And if you can hear the Neoplatonism coming out here, this is it. In other words, the concept of definition finds its meaning in relationship to forms of pure potential. The concept of definition finds its meaning in relationship to forms of pure potential. Now, the concept of position finds its meaning in relationship to the positioning or status of all other actual occasions of experience in a network or nexus. The concept of position finds its meaning in relationship to the positioning or status of all other actual occasions of experience in a network or nexus. In even fewer words, definition is derived from certain metaphysical first principles, which Whitehead calls eternal objects. Position is derived from the principle of relativity. That is, that the position of an entity is relative to all other entities. If you survived that and you didn't have a stroke, back to section 5. There are no self-sustained facts floating in non-entity. There are no things in themselves. The doctrine you must remember is that no proposition can possibly be torn from its systematic or systemic context in the actual world. This is a direct consequence of the 4th and 20th categories of explanation, which we just covered. Now, the point of it all is that a verbal expression of a proposition can embody partial truth, because the only prerequisite for there to be a verbal expression of a proposition is that there is a systematic environment. Verbal expressions presuppose a relational linguistic communal environment. This environment is presupposed in the verbal expression of a proposition's meaning. However, the verbal expression of a proposition does not refer to the universe in all of its detail. One of the practical aims of metaphysics is to accurately analyze verbal expressions of propositions, not only metaphysical, but ordinary ones as well. The one genus or class of facts which makes up a field of specialized science requires a common metaphysical presupposition about the universe. Hence, it's necessary to study verbal expressions of propositions as storehouses of meaning. Now, it's not very wise to accept verbal phrases as adequate statements of propositions. Here, we're making a distinction between verbal phrases and complete propositions. This distinction renders some people's rigid logical assessment of true or false non-applicable and irrelevant. The quote from John Stuart Mill is helpful in this regard to Whitehead. They thought that by determining the meaning of words, they could become acquainted with facts, they being the Greeks. Whitehead says Mill and Whewell both neglect to track down the difficulty of language to its source. He says they both presuppose that language enunciates well-defined propositions. This is untrue. Language is indeterminate because each occurrence of language presupposes some systematic type of environment. Words may refer to multiple meanings. A precise language can only be made when we arrive at complete metaphysical knowledge. We will never arrive at complete metaphysical knowledge, therefore language will never be an adequate expression of propositions in terms of which a simple logical test of true or false may apply. Various schools of thought have attempted to explicitly express the general ideas which are presupposed by the facts of our experience using technical language. But in the realms of philosophy, any new idea in metaphysics results in a disagreement with statements from current schools of metaphysics. It's interesting to point out that one metaphysical school's ideas don't follow from the verbal expressions of another school's, but that's just a statement of the situation of disagreement, and it's not actually a valid criticism. It's like appealing to the way things are, as if that was enough justification that you were right and someone else is wrong. The issue at hand is whether or not the new idea under consideration actually describes reality better than the old one, not whether or not the outcome of your ideas follows from the presuppositions of another metaphysical school. Now, to Whitehead, he defines the truth as the composite nature of organic actualities which make up the world, obtaining adequate representation in the divine nature. In other words, the truth or the situation of reality, whatever that is in the end, must be a composite or collective of organisms or experiencing entities. These entities themselves are participating in the nature of God by virtue of the fact that no two entities of experience can exist in a vacuum from one another. These representations of the divine are what constitute the consequential nature of God, which evolves in its relationship to the evolving world without compromising the eternal primordial conceptual nature of God. In simpler words, the stuff of reality is the body of God and composes what Whitehead calls God's consequent nature. In this way, our philosophy maintains the ontological principle. What is the ontological principle? That there is no determinate truth apart from one actual entity to which that truth can be referred. In Whitehead's articulation, that is God. There is no determinate truth which descends impartially from the partial experiences of many occasions of experience, unless there is a governing occasion of experience into which all other experiences are being synthesized. That occasion of experience Whitehead calls the consequent nature of God. Now, if there's an overt difference between our practice and the philosophy of metaphysics we endorse, then our practice demonstrates that our metaphysics are inadequate and needing revisions. Whatever we practice needs to have its place in our metaphysics. Metaphysics cannot contradict overt and readily observable experience and behavior. In this manner, no one ever should make a divide between philosophy and practice, because if we are articulating our system correctly, these two are one and the same. Metaphysics is the description of general principles which apply to all the details of practice. No metaphysical system can satisfy these tests, however. At the best, we approach the truths we are after. If you remember earlier, our approach can be at best asymptotic, approaching a line by a curve, but never reaching it. There are no precise axioms for us to base all other assertions on. Language also fails us. The only way forward is to use verbal expressions, inadequate though they are, and take them for what they are, They're poorly defined and ambiguous. Now, we should not reason from verbal expressions except when we're trying to gain more clarity by discussing them, as opposed to applying a rigid true, false, meaningless test to them. Verbal expressions are attempts to state general principles, which we will exemplify by describing the facts of experience. We are incapable of understanding the meaning of words and phrases apart from us accurately understanding the metaphysical background which these words and phrases presuppose, as they are part of the same universe, and thus related by the principle of relativity. But language is elliptical, that is to say, hard to understand, and requires us to make a leap of the imagination to understand language's meaning as it relates to our experience. We can't understand the position of metaphysics in developing culture without first remembering that no verbal statement adequately expresses a proposition. Now, old metaphysical systems falsely seem as though they are precise because their words and phrases have leached in and seeped into literature. The propositions expressed seem to fit well with our intuitions about the metaphysical reality, but this is just a confirmation bias. When we trust these verbal statements and argue as if they adequately demonstrate meaning, we accidentally negate what we presuppose in the act of our practice. If you are familiar at all with the philosophy of linguistics, a very controversial area of philosophy of linguistics is the idea of the determinacy caused by language, or language determinism. Certain words, by virtue of their relatively narrow meaning, can shape the way that you view reality. So when we take these verbal statements and argue as if they adequately demonstrate meaning, we accidentally negate what we presuppose in the act of practice. Then we take them as gospel truth and propose them as the first principles, and everyone treats them as sacred doctrines, as if they were plain as day that this is the true nature of reality. The problem with this, of course, is that the actual proposition that this verbal phrase is trying to express, but doing a bad job at, loses its umph when we try to see if it's adequate. In other words, just because you say something doesn't make it so. For example, the grass is green and the whale is big are propositions. The form of verbal expression here is known as subject-predicate, which appears simple and leads us straight to a metaphysical first principle, we might think. But actually, the subject-predicate mode of expression conceals a world of complex and diverse meanings. Thanks for joining us today. I think that's just about all we have. If you haven't joined the learning group, I can't encourage you to do it enough. That way we can chat about what's going on here. You can leave questions. I'm sure there's a lot of questions in this one, especially that part about the 4th and 20th categorical notions. Yeah, I don't really know what else to say about that. It's a difficult section to get through. I tried to do my best to explain it. Shoot me a message on Facebook Messenger or in the group. I'll see you next time on Process and Reality.